A schoolteacher named Darlene Odum was found at the edge of a cotton field on a Sunday morning in September of 1984. And the investigation that followed lasted 11 days. 11 days for a woman who had taught third grade at Pinecrest Elementary for 9 years, who directed the choir at Greater Hope Baptist, who was 34 years old and had never in her life done a thing to deserve 11 days. The sheriff closed the file with the notation "No viable suspect identified" and moved on. And for 40 years the case sat in a cabinet in the Harmon County Sheriff's Office. And the man who killed Darlene Odum drove past that office every week on his way to county commission meetings and never once broke a sweat. Then a retired deputy named Curtis Webb opened a cardboard box he had kept in his garage for 40 years. And everything the county had decided to forget came back. This is a story about what gets investigated and what gets covered, and who decides and why. It is a story about a woman who deserved 40 times what she got, and about one man who knew it and kept the proof, because he believed, even when he had no reason to, that someday someone would be ready to hear it. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to that September. Because to understand what Harmon County lost, you first have to understand who Darlene Odum was, and how completely the world she lived in had already decided what her life was worth. Harmon County sat in the Pee region of northeastern South Carolina, a flat, wide sky country of cotton and tobacco and longleaf pine, where the August heat settled on the land like a weight and stayed through September and sometimes October, and where the rhythms of life had not changed as much as people elsewhere imagined. In 1984, the textile mill in Calvert ran 3 shifts and employed a third of the county, and the tobacco auction in town was still the event of the summer. The long barns filled with leaf and buyers, and the fast chant of the auctioneer that could carry a quarter mile on a still morning. The Confederate battle flag flew above the state capitol in Columbia and had flown there since 1962 and would fly there for 16 more years. The county commission was all white and had always been all white, and the Harmon County Sheriff's Office had one black deputy who was assigned to the townships on the east side of the county and understood, without anyone saying it directly, which investigations were his to work and which were not. Darlene Odum had grown up in Calvert, the daughter of a mill worker and a domestic worker, the oldest of 5, and she had been the first person in her family to finish college, a fact her mother, Estelle, mentioned to anyone who would stand still long enough to hear it, which was everyone, because Estelle Odum was not a woman who undersold her children. She had gone to South Carolina State on a partial scholarship and a lot of determination, and she had come back to Calvert when she didn't have to, turning down a position in Columbia because she had looked at the children of Pinecrest Elementary and understood that this was where she was needed, and because Greater Hope Baptist was her home, and because she had a life in Calvert that fit her in the way that only the place that made you can fit you. She taught third grade, and she was the kind of teacher who remembered, years later, what every child had struggled with and what had finally made it click, the specific Tuesday when something unlocked. She kept a jar of peppermints on her desk for the children who came in hungry and didn't want to say so. And she kept a second jar in the bottom drawer for the children who came in angry and needed a minute before they could learn anything. She could look at a child across a classroom and know, without being told, which jar they needed. She had been teaching for 9 years, and she was 34 years old, and she was not close to done. She ran the choir at Greater Hope with a precision and a joy that were equally matched. And on Sunday mornings, the sound that came out of that white clapboard building carried down the block and around the corner and made people stop on the sidewalk outside and just stand there for a minute. The way you stop when you hear something that reminds you that beauty is real. She had a daughter named Maya, 7 years old, with her mother's eyes and her grandmother's determination already plainly visible. Darlene was saving for a house with a porch, because she wanted Maya to grow up with a porch the way she had grown up with one, with somewhere to sit in the evening when the heat finally broke. She drove a used Datsun that ran better than it had any right to, and sang along with the radio without caring who heard her. She was funny, and exacting, and warm, and there was not a child at Pinecrest Elementary who didn't know exactly which classroom was Miss Odum's and feel something particular, safe, seen, expected to rise, about walking into it. She was last seen leaving Greater Hope Baptist after the Saturday evening choir rehearsal on September 8, 1984. The rehearsal ended a little after 8. She waved goodbye to the last 3 choir members in the parking lot, got in the Datsun, and turned south on Calvary Road. Between there and home, something happened that no one in Harmon County with any power chose to look at hard enough. The man who found her the next morning was a cotton farmer named Ernest Pickett, who was checking the irrigation lines along the eastern edge of his field at first light. She was at the field's border, near the fence line that separated Pickett's property from the land belonging to the adjacent tract. A tract of several hundred acres that had been in the Beaumont family for 4 generations. Her car was not there. Her car was found 3 hours later, parked behind the AIM Church on Route 12, 4 miles away, engine cold, her purse and her keys still inside. 2 things were documented at the scene that first morning. The first was a partial boot impression in the soft soil near the fence line. A large boot, the tread distinct enough that a careful investigator might have made something of it. The second was a small cluster of fibers caught on the fence wire, a pale color, a tight weave, the kind of fabric that did not come from anything Darlene had been wearing. Both were logged. Neither was pursued. The deputy who worked the scene was Curtis Webb, 31 years old, 7 years on the force, the only black deputy in Harmon County. He photographed everything. He bagged everything. He wrote a 12-page incident report that named 3 observations he believed were significant and 2 individuals he believed warranted interview. One of the individuals was a man named Wallace Beaumont, county commissioner, 3rd-generation landowner, whose family's property ran directly to the fence line where Darlene Odum was found. Curtis Webb submitted his report to Sheriff Harlan Pugh on the morning of September 10th. By the afternoon of September 11th, he had been reassigned to traffic duty in the eastern townships and told that the investigation was being handled at the county level. He asked once, in writing, to be kept informed of the case's progress. The request was not answered. Sheriff Pugh ran the investigation for 9 more days. He interviewed a man who had argued with Darlene's brother at a gas station 3 weeks prior. He ran a check on a transient who had been reported in 2 neighboring counties. He did not interview Wallace Beaumont. He did not send the fiber evidence to a lab. He did not pursue the boot impression. On September 21st, he filed his closure notation, "No viable suspect," and the case went into the cabinet. Curtis Webb went home that night and did something that would define the next 40 years of his life. He sat at his kitchen table, and he made copies of everything he had: his incident report, his photographs, his notes, the chain of custody log for the physical evidence, and he put the copies in a cardboard box, and he put the box in his garage, and he told his wife what was in it and why. He told her he didn't know if it would ever matter. He told her he was keeping it because he believed it should exist somewhere outside a cabinet that the wrong people controlled. She told him he was right, and they didn't discuss it again for many years, but the box stayed. Curtis Webb worked another 19 years in the Harmon County Sheriff's Office, was quietly and persistently passed over for promotion and retired in 2003 without ever being asked about the Odum case by anyone in official capacity. He moved with his wife to a smaller house and brought the box with him, and it sat in the new garage. And he did not open it often, but he knew what was in it, and he kept it. Darlene's mother, Estelle, filed 2 formal complaints with the State Attorney General's office in the years after the closure, one in 1985 and one in 1991. Both were acknowledged, and neither produced action. Maya grew up in Calvert, being raised by her grandmother, and she became, in the fullness of time, a middle school science teacher in Columbia. And she had her mother's precision, and her mother's warmth, and her mother's habit of keeping peppermints for the children who came in hungry. By 1994, 10 years had gone. By 2004, 20. By 2014, 30. Wallace Beaumont served on the county commission until 2001, and then retired to his family property, and was spoken of, in the rooms that still remembered him, as a man who had given a great deal to Harmon County. He attended the Methodist Church. His grandchildren played youth league baseball. He gave money to the scholarship fund at the high school. He was a man who had gone on living his life at full volume for 4 decades, and not one official voice in Harmon County had ever asked him a direct question about the night of September 8, 1984. Estelle Odum died in 2016 without an answer. Maya drove down from Columbia for the funeral and stood at her grandmother's grave and made a promise that she said aloud to no one in particular, in the same tone her mother had used when she meant something completely. She meant it completely. Every case on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that deserved far better than the way they ended. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, please take a second to like this video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what keeps these stories from staying buried. Now, let's get back to Darlene. The case had been cold for 40 years when 2 things happened in the same month, and neither of them knew about the other until they did. The first thing was Maya. In the spring of 2024, she contacted the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division's Cold Case Unit and asked, for the 3rd time in her adult life, for someone to look at her mother's case. This time, the unit had a new director and a standing commitment to reviewing cases from the 1970s and 1980s in which racial bias in the original investigation was alleged. Maya was not the first person to allege it in the Odum case. She was the first person to be told yes. The investigator assigned was a woman named Renata Hollins, who had spent 11 years working civil rights-era cold cases and who understood, as a professional and a personal matter, exactly what she was looking at when she opened the Harmon County file. She read Sheriff Pugh's closure notation. She read the 9-page investigation summary. She looked for Curtis Webb's 12-page incident report and found that it was not in the file. Not because it had been lost, but because it had never been transferred. It existed only in the copy Webb had made and taken home in a cardboard box in 1984. She found Curtis Webb through a pension record. He was 71 years old, living 20 miles from Calvert, and when Renata Hollins called him and told him who she was and what she was looking for, he said, "I've got a box. When do you want to come?" He had kept everything. The photographs were clear. The chain of custody log was complete. The incident report named the fiber evidence and the boot impression and the name Wallace Beaumont, and it named them in the careful, methodical language of a man who had understood exactly what he was writing, and exactly why he was writing it so carefully. Hollins sent the original fiber evidence, which remained in the county evidence archive, logged and forgotten, to the State Forensic Lab for modern trace analysis. In 1984, the fibers had been logged and set aside because the technology to say anything definitive about them did not exist at the scale of a rural county sheriff's office. In 2024, it did. The lab identified the fiber composition as consistent with a specific type of canvas work jacket manufactured in limited production in the early 1980s, available through a regional supplier whose records still existed in a business archive in Greenville. One of the supplier's accounts from that period was registered to a property management company in Harmon County. The property management company was wholly owned by the Beaumont family estate. The boot impression photographs from Webb's original documentation were submitted to a forensic footwear specialist who matched the tread pattern to a style of boot manufactured between 1979 and 1986 and discontinued thereafter. The size was consistent with a man of Wallace Beaumont's documented height and build. And there was one more thing. In the evidence archive alongside the fibers was a single item that had been bagged and tagged on the morning of September 9, 1984, and never processed, a cigarette, found 6 feet from the fence line, logged in Curtis Webb's chain of custody as potentially significant. It had sat in that archive for 40 years. Renata Hollins sent it for DNA analysis. The profile it returned was male. When she obtained a warrant for a DNA sample from Wallace Beaumont, 81 years old, living on his family property, as he had lived his entire life, the lab ran the comparison in 4 days. It matched. Hollins drove out to the Beaumont property on a Thursday morning in July with 2 other investigators, and they found Wallace Beaumont on his front porch, a man in his 80s in a cane chair, and they showed him the warrant, and he looked at it for a long time without speaking. His attorney arrived within the hour and advised him not to say anything, and he did not say anything, and he has not said anything since. He did not need to. The DNA was the whole sentence, and it had taken 40 years to be spoken. They arrested him on that porch, on a morning that looked like every other morning on that property for 4 decades. The long, flat fields, the pine brake at the far end, the sky going white with late summer heat. He walked to the car on his own. He did not look back at the house. The news arrived in Harmon County the way a verdict arrives, not with surprise exactly, but with the specific weight of something confirmed that some people had always known and most had chosen not to. At Greater Hope Baptist, where Darlene had directed the choir for 7 years, the current choir director called a special service that Sunday, and the building was full to the steps and beyond, and the sound that came out of it carried down the block the way it always had on Darlene's best Sundays, and people stopped on the sidewalk and stood still for a minute, the way they always had. Maya drove down from Columbia and sat in the 3rd row, in the same pew her grandmother had sat in for 50 years, and she stayed for every minute of it. Wallace Beaumont's family said through a lawyer that they were shocked and that they stood by the man they knew. The county commission passed a resolution expressing condolences to the Odum family, which Maya declined to acknowledge. The people who had known Beaumont as a pillar of the community were asked to reconcile 2 things that could not be reconciled, and most of them went quiet rather than try. He was charged with first-degree murder. Given his age and the evidence, his attorneys negotiated a plea to avoid trial. He was convicted and sentenced to life, which at 81 means what it means, and he was remanded to a state medical facility, and he has not been seen in Harmon County since. Curtis Webb was in the courtroom. He sat in the back row with his wife, the same woman who had told him in 1984 that he was right to keep the box, and when the plea was entered and the judge accepted it, she took his hand. He said afterward that he had been waiting 40 years for the word guilty to be said in a room with official walls around it, and that it sounded exactly the way he had always believed it would. He said he was glad he had kept the box. He said it was the only thing from his career he was entirely certain he had done right. I want to leave you not with the man on the porch in the cane chair, but with the woman the choir still sings for. Darlene Odum was 34 years old. She taught third grade and kept peppermints for the children who came in hungry and directed a choir that made people stop on the sidewalk outside. She had a daughter named Maya and a used Datsun that ran better than it should, and a dream about a house with a porch. She came back to Calvert when she didn't have to because the children there were where she was needed, and that decision, the decision to stay, to give her life to that particular place, was the most essentially her thing she ever did. Maya got her house with a porch. She bought it 3 years ago. She says her mother would have found something specific and correct to say about it, some observation that was both practical and kind, and she sits on that porch sometimes in the evenings and tries to hear what it would have been. The case changed Harmon County and the state in ways that run deeper than a single verdict. The South Carolina Law Enforcement Division established a formal review process for cold cases from 1965 through 1990, in which racial disparity in the original investigation can be documented. A process that did not exist before Maya made her third phone call and was told yes. 47 cases are currently under review. Curtis Webb's methodology, the shadow file, the careful documentation, the chain of custody maintained outside official channels by a man who knew official channels would not hold it, is now the subject of a training module for deputies in the state. The deepest truth of this case is not that Wallace Beaumont was a murderer. It is that the system which protected him was not an accident or a malfunction. It was the system working as it had been designed to work, to protect the right people from the wrong questions, to assign the labor of investigation to those whose findings could be managed, and to ensure that the cabinet where answers went to die was controlled by the people who needed them dead. Curtis Webb knew that in 1984, and he planned for it in the only way available to him. He made a copy, and he kept it, and he waited, without any certainty of outcome, for the world to become the kind of place that might be ready to use it. So I'll leave you with a few questions. Was justice truly served when 40 years passed in which Darlene Odum's daughter grew up without a mother and the man responsible attended county commission meetings and church and his grandchildren's baseball games? What stayed with you most? The deputy who kept the box for 40 years, or the cigarette that sat unprocessed in a county evidence archive for the same 40 years? And how many other cases from this era are sitting in cabinets right now, with shadow files in garages that belong to people who believed, without any reason to, that someday someone would be ready to hear it? Justice found Darlene Odum after 40 years. Stories like hers remind us that truth, however late, always finds its way to the light. If you believe that too, subscribe so you don't miss the next case, and you'll find more solved cold cases waiting in the description below. Thank you for watching.